Chapter 1. The Bride in Blacket was on a damp and mist-laden morning in late November of the year 1891 that the curious affair of the mourning bride first presented itself at our modest quarters in Baker Street. London lay beneath a sullen canopy of fog that clung to the gas lamps like a shroud, muffling the sound of wheels on the wet cobbles and turning the familiar outlines of hansom cabs into vague phantoms gliding through a spectral city. Within the snug interior of our sitting-room, however, the fire burned bright and cheerful, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls and throwing into relief the lean, hawk-like features of my friend Sherlock Holmes. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the hearth-rug, his dressing-gown hanging loosely from his wiry frame, a pipe clenched between his thin lips. Before him lay a spread of newspapers, several maps, a ruler, and what appeared to be the skeletal remains of a clock mechanism. He was at work, as was his peculiar habit on quiet mornings, on some abstruse intellectual diversion. That morning it took the form of timing the arrival of postal vans to different districts of London and tracing their routes upon the map. He had, with typical ingenuity, converted an ordinary clock into a timing device which emitted a sharp click at measured intervals. "You perceive, Watson," he said suddenly without looking up, "that the average delay between the Charing Cross distribution and the Bayswater delivery is 3 minutes longer on Tuesdays than on Fridays. Curious, isn't it?" "Holmes," I replied, smiling, "I cannot fathom what earthly importance the matter can have." "Importance?" He glanced up with a glint of amusement in his grey eyes. "My dear fellow, it has none whatsoever, except to me. And yet, should some wily criminal choose to intercept the morning correspondence, the precise knowledge of such delays might one day prove invaluable." He returned to his work, leaving me to marvel yet again at the unfathomable recesses of that extraordinary mind. I had learned in our years of association that the most trivial of his experiments sometimes proved the key to a future case, while others were mere exercises in mental gymnastics. Our morning tranquillity was interrupted by a sudden, urgent rapping at the door. Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread sounded in the hallway, and a moment later she ushered in a lady dressed from head to foot in the deepest mourning. Her heavy black veil and sombre attire struck an immediate note of tragedy. She paused upon the threshold, visibly trembling, and then advanced with hesitant steps toward Holmes. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, her voice soft and musical, though quivering with emotion. "My name, madam," Holmes replied, rising swiftly and bowing with grave courtesy. "Pray, take this chair by the fire. You are chilled, and I perceive you have been driven through the fog in some haste. Watson, the rug, if you please." I fetched the rug and placed it over her knees as she seated herself. Holmes regarded her keenly, his gaze sweeping over her attire, the quality of her gloves, and the faint mud stains on the hem of her gown. "You have come from Kensington," he said at once. "Your cabman was uncertain of the turn by Knightsbridge, and you were compelled to direct him yourself. You have not had breakfast." The lady started in astonishment. "Why, yes, all that is perfectly true. How could you possibly—" Holmes waved aside the question with an air of gentle impatience. "Merely observation, madam, but time is precious. You are in distress. Kindly tell us, without omission, what has brought you to Baker Street at such an early hour." She drew back her veil, revealing a pale but strikingly handsome face of perhaps 25 years, framed by dark hair. Her eyes were large and luminous, filled with an expression of mingled fear and sorrow. "My name is Mrs. Clara Harrington," she began in low, measured tones. "3 weeks ago I became the wife of Mr. Edward Harrington, a gentleman of good family and considerable means. Yesterday morning I awoke to find him gone, vanished, leaving behind a locked room and an inexplicable scene that has bewildered the police." "Vanished?" I exclaimed. "Yes, Dr. Watson, gone without a trace. We were married quietly at St. Andrew's, Bloomsbury, and took up residence in my late father's house in Kensington. A respectable, though somewhat old-fashioned dwelling. Edward seemed in good health and spirits the previous night, but when his valet went to rouse him at 7, the door of his dressing-room was locked from the inside. It was forced open, but the room was empty. The window was closed and latched. There was no mark of escape, and on the floor lay his wedding coat, folded neatly, and a single black glove, one I had never seen before." Holmes's eyes gleamed. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "A locked room, a missing husband, and a foreign object. Excellent. Pray continue." "The police were summoned at once," Mrs. Harrington went on. "Inspector Bradstreet himself came from Scotland Yard. They searched the house and grounds, questioned the servants, and examined the room. But nothing was found. No footprints in the garden, no ladder against the walls. It is as if—" She broke off, struggling for words. "As if he had simply melted into the air. And the black glove? It was of fine kid leather, gentlemen, but not Edward's size. Too small for his hand. There was no pair, only the one. I took it to the police, but they found no identifying mark. Her voice faltered. "I fear something dreadful has happened. Edward was devoted to me, and to leave without a word is unthinkable." Holmes rose and paced slowly to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He gazed out into the swirling fog for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Harrington," he said at last, "your case is indeed singular. You say this occurred yesterday morning. Why then have you come to me only today?" She hesitated. "Because the police advised patience. They believed, oh, I cannot bring myself to repeat it, they believed he may have gone willingly. That perhaps," she lowered her head, "that perhaps he had reason to abandon me, and you do not credit that theory." "Never!" she cried with sudden passion. "Edward loved me. We were to travel to Paris next week. He had no debts, no enemies that I knew of. There must be some darker explanation." Holmes turned sharply. "Very good. You have done wisely to come. I shall visit your house this afternoon. In the meantime, kindly leave me the glove, if you have it." She produced a small parcel from her reticule, which Holmes opened with delicate fingers. He examined the glove minutely, even taking out a magnifying lens to study the stitching. "German manufacture," he murmured. "Note the fine double stitch at the wrist. A woman's glove, though unusually plain. And see here." He tapped a faint smudge on the inner lining. "Soot, coal soot, I fancy, and recently. Curious indeed." He handed the glove to me for inspection, then turned to our visitor with quiet assurance. "Mrs. Harrington, I make no promises, but I shall undertake your case. If there is a hidden thread, rest assured we shall unravel it." She clasped her hands in gratitude, tears welling in her eyes. "God bless you, Mr. Holmes. You are my last hope." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Watson, be so good as to accompany me to Kensington at 2 o'clock. Until then I have certain inquiries to make." And with that, the first act of the strange drama of the mourning bride came to a close. A drama which, little did I suspect, would lead us into one of the most perplexing mysteries that ever tested the singular genius of my remarkable friend. Chapter 2. A visit to Kensington by 2 o'clock. The fog had thickened into that brown, clinging pall which Londoners accept with the stoicism of a nation bred upon damp. Our cab crawled like some cautious beetle through a forest of invisible trunks, the lamps of other conveyances looming up, wavering and vanishing again as if ships were lost upon a choking sea. Holmes, wrapped to the chin in his long ulster, maintained a silence I had come to recognize as the prelude to a concerted effort of the mind. Once he glanced at the folded black glove which, snugly buttoned, lay within his pocket-book. Once he smiled, whether with amusement or with a private illumination I could not tell, and then he relapsed into that inward withdrawal which transformed his aquiline features into something near ascetic. We found Mrs. Harrington awaiting us in the vestibule of her late father's house, a sober, respectable structure of the Georgian order, its white stone steps made treacherous by the moisture. The hall within was panelled, the floor laid with a turkey runner, and the air faintly perfumed by the dried lavender that the housekeeper, it seemed, had long employed against moths. A tall clock ticked with ecclesiastical gravity in the corner. Its measured beat, I recall, imparted to the scene a solemnity most apposite to our errand. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson?" our client murmured, her voice subdued. "Inspector Bradstreet is still here with the constables. He was unwilling to depart while matters remain obscure." Holmes's eyes flickered in sly pleasure. "Bradstreet? Admirable. The inspector is a sensible man, and his obstinacy, when allied to sense, is an excellent tonic to the careless criminal." He drew off his gloves. "Pray to lead us to the room." We ascended a broad staircase carpeted in red, turned along a corridor, and came at length to a door whose lower panelling bore the splintered testimony of recent violence. Within lay the dressing-room of the absent bridegroom, an apartment of moderate dimensions, well furnished in the modern taste, a cheval glass, a tall walnut press, a washstand with ewer and basin, and a handsome writing-table beneath the window. The single casement looked upon the garden, which fell away to a narrow lane running at the back of the property. I noted the customary articles of a gentleman's toilet: brushes, a comb, a silver-topped jar, pomade, cuff-studs, in their neat places, while upon a cane-chair by the washstand lay a folded coat of superfine black, a silk waistcoat, and a cravat, all arranged with a precision that spoke either of valet's care or of the gentleman's own habit. Inspector Bradstreet, a square-shouldered man with a moustache as stern as a magistrate's brow, greeted us with a curt nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holmes. You're on this, are you? Well, I'm sure you'll find little to your taste. No trapdoor, no hidden passage, and no conjurer in the cupboard. The gentleman was here one moment and gone the next. Through solid oak I took it." Holmes's bow was as polite as his tone was dry. "We shall hope, then, that the oak proves less solid to observation. You forced the door?" "Between 7 and 1/4 past, said Bradstreet, indicating the ragged lock. "Valet's name is Preece. He knocked twice without answer, fetched the footman, and they sent for me. We burst in. The window was latched, as you can see." Holmes crossed to the window, bent, and examined the brass fastener, then the sill, then the line where the sash met the frame. He took from his pocket a little glass lens of enormous power and a folding rule. With the latter he measured the distance from sill to garden, made a note, and peered long at a smear so faint that I doubt any but he could have remarked it. "There is a smudge here," I ventured. "Two," he corrected, "and not of the same origin. Observe, Watson, the duller streak is the ordinary grime, which in London is as inevitable as mortality. But this other, no broader than a child's hair, retains a sheen, as if some oil had blended with the soot and protected it from the damp. You perceive also on the interior a perfectly corresponding film upon the latch. I do not suggest it is recent. I merely observe it." Bradstreet gave a sniff which might have been derision or catarrh. "We looked hard at the window, Mr. Holmes. There's ivy along the wall, enough for a cat or a small boy, perhaps. not for a grown gentleman of weight. The ground below is gravel, not a trace. Gravel often renders the best of footprints to the worst of eyes. Holmes murmured, "But we shall examine it." He moved with seeming idleness about the room, yet I saw his attention dart, like a kingfisher striking, to a dozen points. A minute gouge upon the edge of the writing table, the angle at which the chair was set back, the faint crescent of a watermark upon the carafe, the ash within the little grate beneath the mantel. "Pray, Inspector, did you disturb the fire?" "There was no fire," Bradstreet returned. "Only those ashes." Holmes went upon one knee. With his penknife he teased out a grey shred no bigger than a fingernail, blew upon it, and smiled. "Paper ash," he said, "but not from a common note or letter, too fibrous for that. Some heavier paper, a wrapping, I should judge, or the corner of a card. And here, ha! A dab of sealing wax on the grate's rim, brown, not red. Curious, curious." He rose and turned to the washstand. "Watson, what do you make of the line inside the carafe?" I looked and saw that the glass bore a tide mark lower than half its height. "That water has been poured out since it was last filled." "Just so. Yet the basin is quite dry, and the toothbrush is not recently used. Therefore the water was not employed for the ordinary ablutions." He sniffed at the rim. "A faint scent, carbolic?" "No, orris, delicate, persistent. Ladies use it in the dressing of gloves." His eyes darted to me with that mischievous glimmer I knew so well. "You will keep in mind the glove, Watson." Bradstreet turned to Mrs. Harrington, who had waited, pale and silent, upon the threshold. "Madam, your husband's habits, did he eat or drink in this room?" "Only a glass of water upon retiring," she answered. "He was temperate in all things." Holmes inclined his head and moved to the cheval glass. He set it slightly awry, studied the square of carpet which lay before it, and stooped to lift a corner with delicate fingers. Beneath, a thread, black, fine and short, clung stubbornly to the nap of the underlay. Holmes secured it between finger and thumb, regarded it with a face of porcelain calm, and transferred it to his pocket-book. "What is that?" I asked. "A stitch, perhaps, from some garment newly altered," he said carelessly. "Or from a veil. One must not be too positive." He replaced the carpet and drifted to the cane chair. There the folded coat lay, with the waistcoat and the soft, sober cravat. Holmes lifted the coat between two fingers, as though it were a delicate specimen in a laboratory. His nostrils flared. "Tobacco?" he murmured. "No, a ghost of something floral, orange blossom diluted to homeopathic strength, very proper to a bridegroom's lapel 3 weeks ago, and very lingering if the spray was pinned through. See, Watson, the double puncture in the cloth, and between the threads a pearl-grey dust no thicker than thought." He gave a soft chuckle. "Dust is the court reporter of trifles." Inspector Bradstreet, who had been eyeing these manoeuvres with a scepticism verging upon impatience, now broke out, "Come, Mr. Holmes, you do not suppose the gentleman escaped by smelling his own coat? The door was locked. The key was inside. We found it beneath the dressing-table." "Did you, indeed?" said Holmes. He went to the table and knelt. A narrow space separated its lowest drawer from the floorboards. Holmes took a thin card from his case and swept beneath. The card emerged with a faint smear upon its edge. "Grease," he commented, and then, with a sudden movement, drew forth a tiny brass shaving lodged against the skirting. He balanced it upon a fingernail and held it to the light. "From a screw-head, newly trimmed," he said softly. "And here, on the escutcheon, fresh abrasion. Inspector, was the key in the lock when you burst the door?" "No," Bradstreet returned after a moment. "Now you press me. I recall Priest saying he could not see it. We found it afterward, as I told you, under the dressing-table. It must have been knocked there in the forcing. Must?" Holmes's tone was bland. We shall not insist on the inevitability of that adverb. The key travelled from the lock to the floor, that is certain. The manner of its journey is the question. He turned to Mrs. Harrington. I would be obliged, madam, to speak with the servants. The valet first. A nervy fellow of middle height, dark-haired and narrow-faced, presented himself. Mr. Preece. He kept his eyes fixed upon the middle distance, and answered promptly but without warmth. He had, it seemed, roused his master each morning at 7. Mr. Harrington preferred a tepid sponge and a brisk rub before breakfast. On the previous day he had knocked, waited, knocked again. No answer. He had tried the handle fast. He had fetched the footman. They had called Mrs. Harrington. She had urged them to summon the police. Nothing else, he assured us, was irregular. His master had been in the best of spirits the night before, had supped lightly at 9 in the dining-room, had retired to his chamber at 1:30, and had dismissed Preece as usual with a kindly "Good night. Your master smoked?" Holmes asked. "Not cigars, sir. A cigarette after dinner, perhaps. But he abhorred pipes, said the ghost of them clung to everything, and his boots. Set by the bedroom hearth as I've ever done, sir, for blacking. But he had lately taken to wearing a lighter shoe in the house. Felt soles, sir. For comfort? Ah." Holmes turned a shade of his attention upon the man's right thumb, which bore a faint crescent of black ingrained near the nail. "You are new to the house, Mr. Preece." "A month, sir. And before that, in service at a gentleman's in Bayswater. German, perhaps?" The valet blinked. "No, sir. Birmingham born." "Indeed." Holmes dismissed him with a courteous word, and called next for the housekeeper, Mrs. Barlow, a stiff, respectable matron, to whom the house's reputation was as her own. She had adored the late Mr. Lennox, Mrs. Harrington's father, thought well enough of the new master, and disliked change. No, she had not entered the dressing-room since the search. Yes, she had dusted it the day before. No, she had not observed any card or parcel to be burned in the grate. Yes, the gardener had trimmed back the ivy a fortnight ago at her insistence. "The gardener's name?" said Holmes. "Jacob Hill, sir. He's gone home for his dinner. We shall have a word with him little by little." Holmes crossed to the window once more. "Mrs. Barlow, did you lately polish this latch?" "Not I, sir. I dust." "I do not polish," Holmes nodded. "Quite right." He stood aside to let us view, with the aid of his lens, a marginal brightening on the under edge of the latch, where a living hand, it seemed, had stroked more than once. "Oil," he said, "and soot, a combination found upon the handles of lanterns and in certain mechanical shops. Mr. Holmes," cried Mrs. Harrington softly from the doorway, "what can it mean? Where is my husband?" Holmes's face softened. He took her hand with a gravity that robbed the action of all impropriety. "We are at the threshold of knowledge, madam. Not yet within. Courage a little longer." We descended to the garden at his desire. The gravel, as Bradstreet had warned, told little, yet Holmes, with head bowed and stick reversed, tapped and prodded until he stopped at the base of the ivy. There, beneath its ragged leaves, the soil had been pressed, not deeply, but with a distinct oval. He did not exult. He seldom did. "A foot," he said merely, "and a light one. The pressure is on the forefoot, not the heel. A woman could make it. So might a man in felt-soled slippers," Bradstreet grunted. "And how does a man descend a story in felt slippers on wet ivy without breaking his neck?" "With care," Holmes replied serenely, "or with a cord." He pointed to a bruised segment of ivy stem some 8 feet up, where the leaves were dulled and clotted with the same dull smear we had seen upon the latch. "A cord drawn over will bite and polish. We shall inquire whether such a thing is missing from the house." We made that inquiry at once. No rope, said Mrs. Barlow, was kept near the dressing-room. The coal cellar boasted one for the merchant's deliveries, but it lay on its peg. Holmes, however, insisted upon viewing it and, in the cool subterranean gloom, ran the length between his fingers, sniffed, and laid aside 3 inches of frayed end which, to my eye, matched nothing at all but to his. It seemed matched too much. On our return, he requested to see Mr. Harrington's bedchamber, which adjoined the dressing-room. There he moved the pillows, examined the coverlet, and paused at the bedpost nearest the door. "Here is our soot again," he whispered, indicating a faint smutch at the height of an average man's waist. "And here, Watson, your finger. Feel this grain upon the wood." I touched it. "Roughened? Exactly. A cord rasped here under tension. The bed itself affords an anchor if one drops a line from the post through the crack above the dressing-room door. A neat expedient. Too neat, perhaps." He straightened. "We must not assume the line was used to escape. A line serves as well to admit." There was a brief silence. Mrs. Harrington clasped her hands upon her mourning and stared at the floor. "You mean someone came in?" "I mean nothing, madam, until I know everything," Holmes returned with kindly firmness. "Now, Inspector, if you please, the table drawer." Bradstreet, with a muttered protest that his patience had already been thinned by drought, complied. There was little within. Some stationery, a bottle of brown sealing-wax, a pen, and tucked at the back, a folded square of blotting paper. Holmes held it to the light, then, with that swift precision which was so characteristic, laid a page of blank note upon it, and gently passed the side of a pencil over the surface. Letters leapt out, ghostly shapes, inverted and broken, mere fragments of words. "At Lane, too. Never. Bride." Bradstreet gave a start. "Bride? What's that to do with it?" Holmes's expression was unreadable. "A romantic word, Inspector, but the English language is treacherous. It holds enough meaning to mislead any honest man." He folded the blotter again, very carefully, and returned it to the drawer. "You shall take charge of that, if you please. I advise you not to leave it lying about." There remained, before we quitted the scene, one small event which at the time I scarcely marked, though it afterward assumed for me a significance very different from what I had imagined. Holmes, while Bradstreet argued at some point with Mrs. Barlow respecting the gardener's hours, drifted back to the grate, knelt, and, with a casual cough as cover to the sound, slipped something. What? I could not see, between the leaves of his pocket-book. When I joined him a moment later, his face wore its most blank and innocent expression. "Nothing?" I said. "On the contrary," he replied, "everything." Bradstreet announced that he must go to the yard. "If there's any new nonsense to be found, Mr. Holmes, you'll find it. I have a man watching the back lane and another at the front. If the gentleman comes walking out of the wall, we shall take him." "Commendable vigilance," Holmes said gravely. "Mrs. Harrington, permit me one further liberty. Have you by chance found a small box in which a lady might keep her gloves? A sachet, perhaps, of orris root among them?" She looked surprised. "Yes, in my own room. If you will indulge me with it." She led us across the corridor. Upon her dressing-table stood a rosewood casket. At Holmes's request she opened it. A faint, sweet breath rose, like memory speaking. Holmes selected one glove, not black, but dove-grey, and held it to his nose, then to the light. "Your orris is a shade stronger than the trace I found in the carafe," he mused. "Still, families often share scents. Forgive the liberty." He replaced the glove with a grave little bow, and I fancied that a tinge of colour rose in her pale cheek. When we took our leave, the day had sunk toward that murky twilight which in London passes for late afternoon. In the cab I could no longer contain myself. "Holmes," I cried, "you are withholding something. That brass shaving, those soot marks, the cord. Surely you see your way. My dear Watson, said he, lighting a cigarette and sending a slender stream of smoke toward the cab's rattling roof. I seldom see my way. I found my way. There is a distinction both subtle and profound. You found something in the grate, possibly, and the blotting paper, bride. Words are dangerous parapets, Watson. One leans over too far. You suspect the valet. I suspect that a month's service is long enough for a careless man to contract the indelible tattoo of his employment upon his thumb, and short enough for a careful man to conceal it. Priest is neither, and the footprint by the ivy, light, 4 foot, the slipper. It is as eloquent as a witness who has been coached, said Holmes dryly. We must ascertain who the tutor was. I threw up my hands. Then we are where we began. Holmes's hand, long and sinewy, touched my sleeve. Not quite. We have learned that the locked door is a character actor upon a stage of many props. That soot tells one tale when married to oil, and another when a bachelor. That a key may fall upward as well as down, and that the word bride is an inn with several entrances. Tomorrow morning I must pay a call in the city, and another less agreeable in that small colony of Germany, which has by some miracle taken root in Clerkenwell. Do not trouble me. In the evening, if I am fortunate, we shall invite Inspector Bradstreet to join us for a little entertainment. Nothing theatrical, merely illustrative. And Mrs. Harrington? I asked. Holmes's face, in the dim light, was touched with a gentleness that sat upon it as rare snow upon a dark rock. Mrs. Harrington, he said, must be spared conjecture. The worst service one may render to the innocent is to give them a guess where a fact will do. Let us procure the facts. So ended our first survey of the scene. A survey which, in retrospect, seems to me like the careful touching of a blind man's stick along the edge of a precipice. We had traced the cliff. We had not discerned the path. But Holmes, with that peculiar patience which was to me forever a wonder, settled himself to the night's work as the city choked and throbbed about us. I confess I slept little. The image of the folded coat, the black glove, the word bride, levitating from the blotter like the shade of a thought, all these flickered in my mind as the invisible river gurgled through its arches, and the bells of distant churches told the hours like warnings in a dream. Chapter 3. The Footprints in the Fog. The following morning broke with that strange brightness peculiar to London after a heavy fog had lifted. The sky clear yet pale, the wet streets reflecting every passing hansom like a mirror, and the air tinged with a sharpness that set one's blood briskly moving. I found Holmes already at the breakfast table when I descended, his long fingers neatly dissecting the Times, while beside his plate lay an assortment of notes, telegrams, and scraps of paper, each bearing that crabbed but lightning-swift hand of his which I had so often struggled to decipher in my medical ledger. "You rise late, Watson," he observed without looking up. "An uncharacteristic indulgence. The night was a bad counsellor, I imagine." "You are not far wrong," I replied, sitting by myself. My mind was full of the case. The locked room, the glove, the soot marks. It is a tangled skein indeed. Have you made progress? Holmes folded the paper with that peculiar precision of his, as if the act itself were a logical conclusion. Progress? A step, perhaps. The man who knows one fact more than the police has an advantage. The man who knows one fact less is lost. We are, at this hour, between the two states. He rose, donned his overcoat, and took up his stick. I must visit a certain house in Clerkenwell, where I trust to obtain information of a very definite kind. It is not work for two. Be so good as to hold yourself in readiness. We have an appointment this afternoon with the most singular visitor, one who, if I'm not mistaken, will supply us with the second half of the cipher." I asked no further questions. I had learned that Holmes, when he wrapped himself in silence, was like a hound following a scent, best left unharried. He departed shortly thereafter, leaving me to spend the intervening hours in Baker Street amidst the rattling of cabs and the occasional rattle of Mrs. Hudson's dustpan. It was close to 3 when he returned, his face pale from the keen air, but his eyes bright with that peculiar light I had learned to associate with the scent of game. "Well?" I cried eagerly. He tossed his gloves onto the table. "We are entering upon the more delicate portion of our adventure, Watson. The Clerkenwell Germans manufacture not only fine gloves, but also cordage of peculiar weave employed chiefly in theatrical rigging and certain mechanical contrivances. A most obliging foreman, Herr Baumann, has supplied me with a list of recent sales to private individuals. There have been 2 such purchases in the last fortnight. One is a costume shop in Drury Lane. The other—" he paused for effect, "a Mr. James Selby, of no fixed trade, residing in a lodging-house off Great Portland Street. His description is of a man under medium height with a slight limp. We shall keep that in mind." Before I could inquire further, Mrs. Hudson entered with a visiting card upon a salver. Holmes took it, and a flash of interest crossed his face. "Admit the gentleman," he said. The visitor who entered a moment later was a middle-aged man of clerical bearing, though his black coat was somewhat threadbare, and his boots betrayed more familiarity with London pavements than with the aisles of a church. His face, long and mournful, possessed that curious mixture of humility and suppressed anxiety which I have often remarked in men of the cloth when called into worldly affairs. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he began, with a slight bow, "my name is Reverend Samuel Armitage. I believe I may be in possession of information which touches upon the disappearance of Mr. Edward Harrington." Holmes indicated a chair. "Pray, be seated, Mr. Armitage. You are connected with the family." In a manner of speaking, Mrs. Harrington, Miss Lennox as she was a parishioner of mine at St. Matthew's, Kensington. Her late father was a churchwarden. Yesterday afternoon, when the matter of Mr. Harrington's disappearance became the talk of the parish, I was struck by a circumstance which, at the time, I had not thought of, but a friend advised me to come to you. Holmes leaned forward. "Your friend gave sound counsel. What was the circumstance?" The clergyman cleared his throat. "On the evening before Mr. Harrington vanished, I was walking home along the back lane behind the Lennox house. It is my custom to take a turn after vesper service. As I passed the garden wall, I saw through the mist a figure standing by the ivy, half concealed as if waiting. At first I thought it might be a servant, but the attitude struck me as stealthy. The person was of slight build, wearing what appeared to be a dark cloak, and, I remember this distinctly, leaned heavily on a stick or crutch, as if lame." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A limp, you say?" "Yes." The figure remained there for perhaps a minute. Then, hearing the sound of my approach, it slipped away toward the corner where the lane joins Kensington Road. I followed, but the fog was thick, and the figure vanished. Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. "And the hour?" "9:30, sir. I had just left the vestry." "Excellent, Mr. Armitage. Your observation may prove of the utmost value. You will pardon me if I do not divulge more at this juncture. May I rely upon your discretion?" "Entirely, Mr. Holmes," the clergyman said with grave sincerity. When he had departed, Holmes struck the arm of his chair with sudden energy. "There we have our footprint's owner, Watson. A light step, 4 foot, aided by a crutch. The cord, the latch, the bruise upon the ivy, they fit together like clockwork cogs. Our limping friend in the lane is none other than Mr. James Selby of Great Portland Street, or his agent." I was about to congratulate him on this apparently decisive development when he raised a hand. "Not too fast. Every false scent has its logic. The question is not whether a man could have entered by that means, but whether Edward Harrington departed by any other. For that, we must return to Kensington under cover of evening." And so it was that, at 8:30 that night, we found ourselves once more in the shadow of the Lennox house. The fog had returned, denser than before, curling around the street lamps like ghostly serpents. Holmes had dressed in a plain dark overcoat and carried in his pocket a small dark lantern. We passed through the side gate with Mrs. Harrington's permission and crept down the gravel path toward the garden. The ivy-covered wall loomed before us. Holmes's lantern, open to the smallest chink, cast a thin beam upon the leaves. There, just as before, was the faint oval of a 4 foot pressed into the soil. Beside it, another mark, elongated as if made by the ferrule of a crutch. Holmes examined both with meticulous care, then straightened. "Not made last night," he whispered. "Made that evening. The edges are softened by dew, but the impression is distinct. The crutch mark bears a nick at its tip. See here, Watson, a small crescent. I shall wager that Herr Baumann's list describes Selby's cane with precisely that flaw." He turned his lantern upon the wall. A length of thin cord dangled from the ivy, its end looped around a stout stem. Holmes gave it a gentle tug. It held firm. "So," he murmured, "our limping friend came in, not out. But did he leave?" We searched the garden in widening circles, Holmes's lantern probing the fog like a spear. Suddenly he stooped, gave a low exclamation, and held up his find, a scrap of fabric, black and finely woven, caught on a nail of the garden gate. "A woman's veil," he said softly. "Or the corner of a mourning cloak," I started. "Mrs. Harrington. No, this is of cheaper make than hers. We are dealing with a visitor uninvited and, I think, unsuspected." Holmes pocketed the scrap and extinguished the lantern. "Come, Watson, we have seen enough for tonight. Tomorrow we pay a visit to Mr. James Selby, and perhaps, if fortune smiles, to the veiled lady who haunts the lane." We departed as silently as we had come, leaving behind the garden, the cord and the faint damp footprints. As the cab bore us back toward Baker Street through the swirling fog, I could not help but feel that we were descending deeper into a labyrinth whose walls were built not of brick and ivy, but of secrets. Holmes sat motionless, his sharp profile outlined against the passing lamps. At last he spoke. "Watson, do you recall the word upon the blotting paper?" "Bride," I said. "Just so. A bride, a glove, a limp, and a veil. 4 pieces of a puzzle. Tomorrow we will be the 5th. Chapter 4. The Limping Man of Great Portland Street. It is a curious habit of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes that, when he senses the approach of a decisive encounter, he dresses himself not in theatrical pretense, but in an almost studied plainness, as though the mind might strike more cleanly when the body is stripped of ornament. Thus it was that, on the morning following our nocturnal inspection of the Lennox garden, he appeared in a sober suit of pepper and salt, with a black tie and an old felt hat, and announced in the briefest terms that we should pay our respects to a certain Mr. James Selby of Great Portland Street. "The theatre of operations narrows," he remarked, drawing on his gloves with that quick economy of movement which bespoke a disciplined intellect. "When a limping man leaves the mark of his ferule beside a lady's veil on a grieving bride's wall, we must learn whether he limps from destiny or design." Great Portland Street in the morning retained something of the night's smoke in its shop fronts and awnings. A thin November sun cast uncertain rays upon the windows. Here a pianoforte maker's apprentice tested an obstinate note with the solemnity of a small priest. There a print seller tilted engravings of Alpine passes to catch the shy light, and on the corner a costermonger's cry rose and fell like the refrain of a mournful ballad. We discovered the lodging-house, a clean, narrow property with a polished knocker and the virtue, rare in its breed, of a mat without holes. Our ring was answered by a small, brisk woman of fixed hair and unfixed temper, who gave her name as Mrs. Fremlin. She looked us up and down, as if our character depended on the amount of mud our boots had collected, and finding it within the bounds of decency, permitted us to enter the passage. "Mr. Selby?" said Holmes, with a card between finger and thumb. "Out till dinner, gentlemen," she returned, though her eyes slid toward the half-open door at the end of the corridor with a swift, involuntary motion the observant prize in such women. "He's not a bad tenant, mind you, pays on the nail, but he keeps queer hours, and a queer stick, if I may say so. The neighbours complain when he stumbles on the stairs." Holmes smiled in his pleasant way. A man must stump somewhere. Might we wait? We are likely to save him inconvenience by laying our business at once. She wavered, then admitted us to a modest sitting-room, whose ornaments comprised a shell-work frame, a vase of dried grasses, and 2 chromolithographs of robust Highlanders, whose kilts owed more to the lithographer's fancy than to the climate. We had not sat for 5 minutes when a step sounded in the passage, a step of 2 beats and a third metallic tap, and the door, opening without ceremony, admitted the subject of our inquiry. Mr. James Selby was a man under the middle height, sparely built, with a sharp, beakish nose, and the sallow complexion of one who has known want more intimately than want has known gratitude. A black moustache, cropped close, accentuated the hungry line of his mouth. His dark hair was brushed forward to conceal an irregularity at the temple. In his right hand he carried a stout stick fitted at the end with a ferrule of iron. The left hand, gloved, rested loosely in the pocket of his coat. His gait, in entering, was that of one accustomed to shift weight from an injured limb. Yet there was, to my eye, a curious regularity in the rhythm, as though pain had been drilled to obedience. He halted, and his eyes, quick, watchful, shot from one to the other of us. "Gentlemen," said he, in a voice whose lowness did not wholly veil a Cockney edge, "you are in my room." "In your house, Mr. Selby," Holmes corrected, rising with that chilly courtesy which can tincture politeness with menace. "We have asked your landlady to leave. My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson." I saw the name pass through the man like a faint electric current. His fingers tightened on the stick. His eyes lost a shade of their defiance and acquired calculation. "Holmes, eh?" he said. "You make it your business to—" "What?" "Pluck the truth out of men like a chicken. I've done no wrong. I'll tell you that to start." Holmes's smile did not alter. "Let us begin, then, with innocence and work outward. You were, 2 nights ago, in a lane behind a house in Kensington, where a gentleman, Mr. Edward Harrington, vanished under singular circumstances. You had with you a length of cord and this. Holmes's finger indicated the iron ferrule, whose tip bears a slight crescent flaw to the left. The mark you left in the soil records it very faithfully. Selby's eyes flinched, no more than a heartbeat, but to my practised habit of watching patients for signs of pain, it was as an echo heard within a shell. "I walk where I please," he muttered. "London's not owned by wedding folk." "A philosophical proposition," Holmes returned. "Does your philosophy also encompass purchases from Herr Baumann's manufactory in Clerkenwell, a specialty cord used by theatrical riggers and any person who wishes an inconspicuous strength in a small compass?" Selby's jaw shifted. A man may buy a rope without setting up a gallows. Just so. And a glove without setting up a marriage. A black glove, for instance, of German make and fine kid. A woman's glove, plain, without ornament. At the mention of the glove, the man's left hand, still pocketed, tremored the smallest fraction. He drew it forth at once, as if to forestall imputation. The glove upon it was not black but tan, cheap and well worn. "I don't dress like a baronet," he said. "You'll find no kid in my wardrobe." "On the contrary, I should expect your wardrobe to contain very little that would survive close inspection." Holmes's gaze had fallen to the tip of the ferrule. With the quickest of motions he stooped, touched the iron with the end of his pencil, and raised the lead. It bore a fine, dark smear. He regarded it with relish, coal soot alloyed with a trace of lamp oil. Our old acquaintance, Selby, had had enough. He swung the stick to the corner with a clatter, and came a pace nearer, chin thrust. "If you think I did aught to that gentleman, you've another thing, Mr. Holmes. I don't know your married swell, nor his lady, nor their house. I keep to myself. Ask the theatres. I've worked flies up Drury Lane and the Queen's when they need a hand, rigs and drops and such. I took a turn round Kensington, that's true. A man has a right to walk, and if I had a bit of cord it was for a job. There's no law against that." Holmes stood perfectly at ease, fingers linked behind him. "There is a law against telling untruths to the police. It is an elastic law, but it exists. I am not the police. I am prepared to be entertained." Selby's lips writhed into something like a grin. "Then you'll be disappointed, sir, for I'm dull company. I was in the lane because I'd a letter to deliver at a house nearby. There's your entertainment. I did not deliver it because I thought better of the errand. That was about 9:30. I turned back and I left. If a person says something different, he's not as godly as his collar." "Ah," said Holmes, in a tone of such pleasant indifference that I knew some note had sounded for him alone. "A letter not delivered. A most benevolent omission. The world owes you a debt. May I see your lodging?" "My what?" The man's quickness deserted him for an instant. "Your room, Mr. Selby. You have nothing to conceal, you say. Your landlady will oblige us, I am sure." Mrs. Fremlin, appealed to, had the air of one watching a quarrel from the curtain, with keen professional interest. "If the gentleman's willing, Mr. Holmes, I've no objection. Mind the stair. He does bang it up with that stick, so I mustn't be held to account for dents." Selby hesitated, then jerked his head and led the way. The stair protested under his double-beat cadence. A door on the first landing opened to a chamber scarcely larger than the bed which consumed it. A trunk stood at the foot, a chair before a small washstand, and a row of nails along the wall bore a coat, a scarf, and a pair of trousers. The window looked upon a slate roof and a slice of smoky sky. Holmes gave the briefest glance about, then went to the trunk. "With your leave," he said, and, without waiting for it, opened the lid. The contents were as meagre as the outward show. A spare shirt, much darned, a rag of stage blue, a coil of thin cord, neatly wound and tied with a sailor's hitch, and at the bottom a narrow wooden box. Holmes took it up, weighed it in his hand, and opened it. Within lay a set of tools, a small hand drill, 2 awls, a bradawl, a packet of screws, and a brass plate chipped along one edge. Your trade, Mr. Selby. Odds and ends, he said sullenly. I fix things. The theatre's like a man can do with his hands, and if a gentleman has a latch to sweeten, or a blind to mend, I'll oblige. Holmes held the brass plate to the light. Its holes, countersunk for screws, bore fresh scoring. He let it drop back into the box with a little clink. Then his eyes wandered to the washstand. The basin was ringed, not by soap, but by a faint pearly dust. He touched it and lifted his finger to his nose. Orange blossom, he murmured. Faint but indelible, Selby's face shut like a knife. Scent on a man's basin. That's your case, is it? The landlady soaps the linen. I can't speak to her flowers? Quite, said Holmes, as if struck by the justice. We will not quarrel with roses over their thorns. Watson, do you notice the ferrule's shadow? He indicated the floor, where the stick, cast aside, lay upon a small oval of discoloration near the skirting board. The mark was not of rust nor dirt, but of pressure. The boards had polished themselves under repeated contact. A faithful witness, Holmes continued gently. Our friend's limp is real enough in this room, more regular than any pantomime could accomplish. In the lane, however, well, soil tells a tale that oak does not. There came a violent rapping from below, the hurried tramp of boots upon the hall tiles, and the voice of Inspector Bradstreet in the passage, a voice that carried the confidence of a man who sees the end of a chase before he has sighted the quarry. Mr. Holmes, are you above there? So you are. And is that your bird? He pushed into the doorway, 2 constables looming behind him. His eye swept the room, took in the coil of cord upon the trunk, the toolbox, the stick, and Selby himself with the speed of a veteran who trusts the world to arrange his triumphs when he arrives. We have you, my lad, he announced. James Selby, I arrest you on suspicion of being concerned in the disappearance of Mr. Edward Harrington of Kensington. Selby's thin chest swelled. On what? On what? Bradstreet repeated with relish. On your person answering to the description given by a reverend gentleman in the lane at 9:30. On your purchases of cord from Herr Baumann. On the mark of your iron upon the Lennox ivy. And on this. He stooped and plucked from the pocket of the hanging coat a scrap of sheer black, frayed at the edge. A veil, my boy, the very twin of that left upon the nail of the garden gate. I confess my heart gave a leap, for the fragment seemed damning. Selby's colour fled. That's not mine, he gasped. That coat, I lent it to a man. To the Archbishop of Canterbury, I dare say, Bradstreet said, dry as chalk. You may save your tales for the magistrate. He turned to Holmes with a flash of good humour. Well, Mr. Holmes, you cannot deny that the shoe fits. Holmes's smile was as thin as a razor's gleam. The shoe is admirably cut, Inspector. Whether it fits the foot remains to be proved. Bradstreet's moustache bristled. You're hard to please. What do you lack? We have the limp, the cord, the oil, the soot, the veil. And the man. Holmes finished softly. You have the man. Take care you do not lose the case in the satisfaction of the arrest. It was not in Bradstreet to bridle where the prey lay within reach. He nodded to the constables. Bring him. Selby, with a last fierce look at Holmes. Was it reproach, or contempt, or a desperate appeal to a mercy Holmes did not dispense? Allowed himself to be led away. The tramp receded. Mrs. Fremlin's lament rose and fell like a cracked bell. Silence dropped upon the small room. Holmes stood motionless for some seconds, his eyes half closed, his head a shade inclined, as if he listened to some echo we could not hear. At length he turned to the trunk again, and with the point of his penknife lifted the coil of cord. Beneath it, almost pressed into the wood by its weight, lay a tiny object which, once seen, could easily be overlooked again. A sliver of glossy black, not unlike a fish scale. Holmes secured it between forefinger and thumb. "Jet," he said in that same inward tone. "From a bead, I should say, snapped clean. A mourning ornament, middle quality, northern cut." He did not hand it to me. Instead, he palmed it absently, as though it were a coin of no value. His eye had gone again to the basin, to the faint pearly ring round the bowl. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the coat laid on the cane chair, the double puncture in the lapel, and the pearl-grey dust threaded among the fibres? A bridal dust. Orange blossom returns to haunt us. It is a clinging ghost. You think Selby? I think Selby has been invited into a play wherein he believes himself to be the principal actor." Holmes returned. "It is the commonest vanity of underlings. The audience applauds the clown. The manager counts the takings. We descended the stairs. In the passage, Bradstreet waited, flushed with triumph. You have a knack for souring a man's success, Mr. Holmes." He grumbled, though not ill-naturedly. "I'll have this fellow before a magistrate within the hour." "I would advise haste, Inspector," said Holmes mildly. "The limping man is of a kind to slip through cracks. But if you value the economy of your time, you will also have a word with the costumier in Drury Lane, who purchased cord of the same make, and with any establishment which repairs or restrings mourning jewellery. The veil fragment, guard it carefully. Its twin may yet be of greater interest than its owner supposes." Bradstreet eyed him. "Do you take me for a fool, Mr. Holmes?" "I take you for a tenacious man," Holmes replied, bowing, "and tenacity is a virtue which sometimes earns the gratitude of the truth. Come, Watson, we have our own appointments, to wit, a glove that carries soot like a coal-heaver, and a carafe that smells of a bride." As we emerged into the pale noon, the city seemed to shift about us like the stage flats of Selby's theatres. A man was taken, a case, one would say, completed. Yet in Holmes's tread I heard no relaxation, and in his profile there was none of that airy satisfaction which sometimes accompanied his neatest victories. He swung his stick gently, and when he spoke, it was with the voice of a musician tuning between movements. "We have our first suspect and our first applause, Watson," he said. "Take care that you do not clap your hands before the conductor lifts his baton again. You doubt his guilt?" "I distrust his convenience," he returned. "Consider. A veil fragment in the very pocket most accessible to a constable's thumb. A coil of cord so obligingly coiled. The iron ferule's flaw imprinted as if from a textbook. And above all, a limp which, though practised, knows the measure of the stair better than the measure of wet earth. No, my dear fellow, I suspect Mr. Selby is what a dramatist would call a business. A piece of stage action designed to direct attention, not to conclude it." And the true curtain, Holmes's smile flickered and died, hung as yet, but not where you would look. This evening we shall trouble Mrs. Harrington once more. There is a question of light and water, and of a key that could fall where it did not. He hailed a cab. As we climbed in, a church bell tolled the hour with solemn monotony, and the great city, beating like a heart under its brown November veil, kept time. The limping man was in custody. The bride was in mourning, and Holmes, my brilliant, unfathomable companion, had, I felt, only just taken up his bow. Chapter 5. The Glove and the Key. The arrest of James Selby had, for the moment, brought the case into that deceptive lull which so often precedes its most violent turn. Inspector Bradstreet, flushed with the satisfaction of a man who has finally grasped something tangible, declared that the game was up, and predicted a swift confession once Selby faced the magistrate. Yet Holmes, as I knew well, had a marked distrust of convenient narratives. When a puzzle arranged itself too neatly, his instinct was to turn the pieces over and examine their hidden sides. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when he flung aside his gloves, reached for his violin, and began to play, not with the languorous reverie he sometimes indulged in after victory, but with that quick, precise fingering that to me always signalled intense mental activity. The notes, clear and deliberate, seemed less like music than like the striking of flint upon steel. "Watson," he said suddenly, breaking off mid-phrase, "what is the difference between a key that is dropped and a key that is placed?" I was taken aback. "Why, one falls by accident, the other by intention." "Exactly. The difficulty is that both end up upon the floor. But one leaves a story, the other leaves silence. You recall where the valet found Mr. Harrington's dressing-room key? Under the dressing table. Quite. And do you recall the brass shaving I collected from the skirting beneath? Yes. Then, my dear fellow, we must pay another visit to Kensington. This time, not to the garden, but to the dressing-room itself. A mystery may be read as easily in the fall of a key as in the handwriting of a will. We arrived in Kensington that same afternoon. Mrs. Harrington, pale and wan from sleepless nights, received us with quiet gratitude. Bradstreet's men still maintained their watch at the lane and gate, but the inspector himself had gone to the yard to oversee Selby's processing. Holmes asked to be admitted again to the dressing-room, and locked the door behind us with a gravity that immediately set my nerves on edge. He went first to the lock, examining it anew with his lens. Then, without a word, he lay down flat upon the carpet, extending his hand and sliding it beneath the dressing-table. After a moment he withdrew a small piece of stiff paper, a card no larger than a playing card, creased sharply across the middle. He handed it to me. "What do you make of that?" The paper was unmarked, save for a faint sheen on its upper surface. "Merely a card," I said. "Perhaps packing material." "Not merely." "Watson, precisely. This was a wedge. Observe." He placed the card in the lock and, by a delicate movement of his fingers, demonstrated how a key might be balanced upon it, then drawn inward by a thin cord passed through the keyhole. "The cord," he continued, "once pulled, slides the key inward to the floor beneath the dressing-table. The card folds silently, collapses, and can be drawn out by the same string. The key falls without sound, a trick worthy of a conjurer or a careful housebreaker." I stared. Then the key was removed from the lock, evidently by someone on the outside. You will note the abrasion on the escutcheon I remarked before, a telltale sign of manipulation. But for what purpose? To lock the door after entry, or after exit? Holmes replied softly. "It is the ambiguity that delights me. Someone unlocked the door, entered or admitted another, then locked it from within and withdrew the key by artifice, leaving no human trace but a card and a brass shaving. Consider, Watson, who would possess both the opportunity and the ingenuity for such a manoeuvre?" I thought hard. Selby, perhaps? He had cord, tools. Yes, and a limp that might serve as useful camouflage. Holmes interrupted. "But Selby is a hired hand, not a mind. This trick was conceived by someone who understands both locks and perceptions. The card suggests forethought, the shaved brass improvisation. That is a dangerous combination." He rose and turned his attention to the glove once more. Mrs. Harrington had placed it in a drawer for safekeeping, wrapped in a handkerchief. Holmes took it gently between his fingers, held it to the light, and then to his nose. The orris remains, though faint, but here on the forefinger, a smear of something darker, soot mixed with lamp oil. And note this inner lining, Watson, a single loose thread, as if the glove had been worn over a ring. I examined it and indeed saw a faint impression inside, circular and slightly raised, which suggested the wearer had not removed some ornament before donning it. "Now," said Holmes, "tell me, what woman wears a black kid glove of fine German make, carries orris in her toilet water, and visits a house in Kensington at 9:30 on a foggy night?" My thoughts flew at once to Mrs. Harrington. "Surely not. No," Holmes said firmly. "This glove is smaller than Mrs. Harrington's and plainer. Her gloves are London-made and of a higher cut. Besides, she was with her maid at the hour in question, receiving letters. I have made inquiries. No, this glove belonged to another woman, a woman who moves with care, leaves few traces, and has some connection, direct or indirect, to the missing bridegroom." He returned the glove to its wrapping, and then, with unexpected briskness, began pacing the room, tapping his fingertips together. "We have, Watson, 3 theatrical acts playing simultaneously. Act 1, The Public Crime, starring James Selby. The Limping Man, the Cord, the Ferule. This is the act Scotland Yard sees, and for which they have conveniently arrested their villain. Act 2, The Hidden Ingress, executed by someone capable of removing a key and entering silently. Act 3, The Intimate Intrusion, signalled by a glove and a trace of bridal scent. All 3 acts intersect in this room, but their authors are not the same." "And Edward Harrington?" "Ah," Holmes murmured, "he is either the audience or the playwright." At that moment, a sharp knock came at the door. Mrs. Harrington's voice called softly, "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Bradstreet has returned. He says there is something you ought to hear." We followed her downstairs to the drawing-room, where Bradstreet awaited us, rubbing his hands with ill-disguised triumph. "Holmes," he began, "your limping man has sung. Not a full aria, mind you, but enough to keep the magistrate awake." "What has he said?" Holmes asked. Bradstreet consulted his notes. "He admits to being in the lane, carrying the cord, and admits to having been engaged by a woman, unidentified, veiled, and speaking in a foreign accent, German or Austrian, to deliver a letter to the Harrington house at precisely 9:30 on the night in question. She paid him handsomely, and instructed him to wait by the garden wall until she returned. When she did not appear, he left, fearing a trap. He swears he never entered the house." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And the letter?" "He burned it," Bradstreet said sourly. "Claims he feared to be implicated. But he remembers this much. The envelope bore no address, only a single word written in an elegant hand. Bride." I caught my breath. "Holmes, the blotting paper!" "Yes," Holmes said. "The spectral word has acquired a voice," Bradstreet went on. "He also denies ownership of the veil fragment found in his coat. Says it was not his coat that night, that he lent it to another man backstage at Drury Lane. A likely story, of course." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Not so likely as to be dismissed out of hand, Inspector. Veils, gloves, cards, cords, letters. The stage is set, but the cast is still being assembled. Keep Selby under watch. Do not overplay your hand. If the true author of this affair believes the curtain has already fallen, he or she may take liberties." Bradstreet grumbled but acquiesced. He had learned enough of Holmes's methods to know that the quiet moments often produced the most thunderous revelations later. When he had gone, Holmes turned to Mrs. Harrington with a sudden gentleness that was rare in him. Madam, there is a question I must ask, and I beg you to answer without reservation. Was there any person, any woman, connected to your husband's life before your marriage, who might bear him a grievance, or whose existence might cast a shadow over your union?" Mrs. Harrington's face paled further. "No," she whispered. "Edward spoke little of his past, but I know of no woman. None." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Very well. Forgive the intrusion. I shall trouble you no more today." As we left the house, the dusk was settling. A thick, swirling fog rolling in once more, muffling the sounds of the city like the drawing of a heavy curtain. Holmes walked in silence, his lean figure barely visible through the mist. At last he spoke, low and intense. "Watson, the letter was the invitation, the glove, the presents, the key trick, the entry. But the exit, that is what eludes me. A man does not vanish into a locked room unless someone wishes the world to believe he has done so, and those who construct illusions often stand nearest to the footlights." Chapter 6. A second vanishing. 2 days had passed since our return to Kensington, and during that time the case had grown neither clearer nor quieter. James Selby, the limping stagehand, remained in custody, alternately sullen and defiant. Inspector Bradstreet, convinced that the net was closing, spent his energies in chasing the provenance of veils and theatrical cordage, and Mrs. Harrington, worn thin by anxiety, withdrew more and more into a melancholy silence, receiving only Holmes and myself. London, for its part, continued to churn beneath its November fog, indifferent to the small human dramas that played out behind shuttered windows. Holmes, however, was anything but indifferent. I'd seen him restless before, but rarely in such a state of quiet, coiled tension. He spent long hours pacing the sitting-room of Baker Street, hands behind his back, head bowed, occasionally stopping to make brief, cryptic notations on scraps of paper, which he would then burn in the fire. Twice he sent me on seemingly trivial errands. Once to a glove shop on Regent Street, to inquire about black kid gloves with distinctive German stitching. Once to the chemist's to purchase a small quantity of gum arabic. Of the purpose behind these tasks he said nothing. On the third morning, while the city was still half asleep beneath a thin veil of fog, a sharp knock came at our door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face unusually pale. "It's a constable, Mr. Holmes," she said. "From Kensington. Urgent." The man was ushered in, a young constable flushed from cold and exertion. "Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. There's been another incident at the Harrington house, sir. Mrs. Harrington sent word to you at once." Holmes snatched his coat from the peg. "What sort of incident?" "A disappearance, sir," the constable said, his voice dropping instinctively. "The housemaid, Ellen Clark, has gone missing since last night. Her bed hasn't been slept in, and her cap and shawl are gone. The housekeeper swears she saw her in the scullery after supper. This morning, nothing." Holmes's eyes sharpened like drawn steel. "Watson, your hat." We were in a cab within minutes, the fog thickening with every street we passed, until Kensington itself seemed like a city submerged in smoke. The Harrington house loomed sombre and still against the milky air. Within, the household was in an uproar. The housekeeper, Mrs. Barlow, wringing her hands, the footman answering the police with bewildered repetition, Mrs. Harrington seated in the morning room, pale as ivory. Holmes wasted no time. "Where was she last seen?" "In the scullery, sir," Mrs. Barlow said, her voice quavering. "About 10 o'clock. She'd finished with the supper things, and said she'd be off to bed in a bit. She's a steady girl, Mr. Holmes. Quiet, never gives trouble. She wouldn't run off without telling someone." "Any callers at the house last night?" Holmes asked. "None, sir. We've had constables posted outside since Mr. Harrington disappeared. No one came or went. Holmes frowned slightly. The girl's room? We followed Mrs. Barlow up the back stairs to a small attic chamber. It was simple and tidy. A narrow bed, a chest, a small table with a jug and basin. Her shawl and cap were missing, as the constable had said, and the bed had not been slept in. Holmes examined the room minutely, but apart from a faint trace of candle wax on the window-sill, there was nothing unusual. She left of her own accord, Holmes said quietly. Or someone persuaded her to leave. But how, sir? Mrs. Barlow wrung her hands again. The police are outside, front and back. She'd have to pass them. Holmes moved to the window. It was small and set high in the gable, but opened onto the sloping roof that led down toward the garden. He raised the sash and leaned out, examining the tiles. A thin, wet film of soot streaked one tile near the edge. "Ah," he murmured. "Our old friend again." We descended to the scullery. Holmes examined the door, still bolted from within, and then turned to the fireplace. It was large, as was common in older houses, with a narrow flue leading upward. He shone his lantern into the black throat and gave a sharp exclamation. "Watson, look!" I peered in and saw a length of fine cord dangling down from the flue, looped neatly around one of the internal iron braces. The cord was taut and freshly cut at the lower end. She did not climb up, Holmes said softly. Someone climbed down. We hurried into the garden. The morning fog lay heavy over the shrubs, and the ivy glistened with moisture. Near the kitchen wall, beneath the flue, the gravel bore several impressions, not of boots, but of smaller, lighter shoes. Holmes knelt and studied them carefully. "Female," he murmured. "Narrow foot, no heels, possibly house shoes. Watson, look here. The 4-foot pressure again, light, deliberate. And there, see that? A mark of the same ferrule we saw before, but this time deeper, as if bearing more weight. Selby?" I asked. "Selby is in custody," Holmes replied. "But his stick may not be." As we moved toward the garden gate, Holmes stopped suddenly. A constable approached from the lane, removing his helmet with a deferential nod. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. We've been watching, as instructed. No one passed in or out last night. Did you hear anything?" The man hesitated. "Well, sir, about midnight, I heard a faint tapping sound from the kitchen side. Thought it might be a shutter loose in the wind. It stopped after a minute." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Midnight," he said. "Watson, the girl was last seen at 10. 2 hours, ample time to prepare, to persuade, to coax." He turned back to Mrs. Barlow. "Did Ellen Clark receive any letters recently? Any visitors? Any unusual behaviour?" The housekeeper shook her head. "None, sir. She's a quiet girl. Keeps to herself. She's been in Mrs. Harrington's service for 2 years." "And she admired her master?" Holmes asked almost idly. Mrs. Barlow blinked. "Why, yes, sir. We all did. He was kind to the servants, never raising his voice. She was fond of him like the rest." Holmes gave a slow nod. "Affection can be a lever in clever hands. I fear, Mrs. Barlow, that your Ellen did not vanish alone." Later that afternoon, after the police had combed the house and surrounding gardens to no avail, Holmes and I sat once more in the drawing-room with Mrs. Harrington. She had grown visibly weaker, the strain carving hollows beneath her eyes. She clutched a handkerchief tightly in her hands as Holmes questioned her. "Madam," he said gently, "did Ellen Clark have any confidants? Anyone in the neighbourhood she might have trusted?" "Only her cousin," Mrs. Harrington said faintly. "A seamstress who lives near Brompton Road. Ellen sometimes visited her on Sundays." "Good. Watson, you will pay a call on this cousin tonight. Make quiet inquiries. Say nothing about the investigation," I agreed at once. Holmes then turned his attention to the mantelpiece, upon which a black-edged letter lay unopened. Mrs. Harrington followed his gaze. "It arrived this morning," she whispered. "I cannot bear to read it." Holmes took the letter delicately. It was addressed in a hand both elegant and foreign, the loops and flourishes reminiscent of German script. The postmark was London, St. Pancras district. He broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet within. There were only a few lines in that same elegant hand. "The bride has not yet mourned enough. When the hour strikes, she will understand the vow that was broken." Mrs. Harrington gave a faint cry. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "The letter is not for you, Watson," he said softly. "It is for the stage. Someone is playing this case like a drama, and every act is written in advance." That evening I visited the seamstress cousin as instructed. She was a plump, good-natured woman who was genuinely distraught at Ellen's disappearance. She told me that Ellen had indeed visited her the previous Sunday and had spoken with uncharacteristic excitement about a secret. She had not said what it was, only that she had been trusted with something important and that it would change everything. The cousin assumed it was some romantic matter. Ellen had promised to explain more in a week's time. When I returned to Baker Street with this information, I found Holmes waiting, his pipe cold, his eyes glittering with that distant look that told me his thoughts were racing ahead. "Well, Watson?" he asked. I told him everything. When I finished, he gave a single sharp nod. "So," he said, "the hidden hand tightens its grip. First the bridegroom, then the maid. Both vanish under circumstances impossible to ordinary reason. Both are connected by secrecy, by a glove, by a letter, and by a midnight visitor who walks without sound." He rose and took his hat. "Holmes, where are you going?" I asked. "To St. Pancras," he replied. "There is a handwriting I wish to see again, and perhaps a certain E will prove less elusive when pursued by daylight." That night I lay awake long after midnight. The image of the dangling cord in the scullery flew, fixed in my mind like some dark omen. 2 disappearances, 1 locked room, 1 silent visitor, and somewhere in the fog, an unseen playwright moving the figures on his stage with cruel precision. "Come," he said, "we shall admire Mr. Crome's taste." Crome & Sons received us with that mixture of courtesy and suspicion which is the common coin of a small tradesman in the presence of unusual custom. Mr. Crome, upon learning Holmes's name, became at once more deferential and more cautious, a trick of the wary. Holmes laid upon the counter the tiny sliver he had palmed in Selby's room. "I collect fragments," he said pleasantly. "Memory is unreliable. Things are less so. Will you tell me about this?" Crome turned the sliver in tweezers beneath his gas jet. "Jet, sir. Whitby cut, middling grade. Broken from a rosary bead, if I'm not mistaken. See the line of the bore. We had 2 such restings this month. One was for the Reverend Armitage. His patronesses send him errands. The other, he hesitated the merest instant, was for a lady who did not give her name, a veiled lady. Holmes inquired as if discussing the weather. Many of my customers wear veils, sir. Crome said dryly, "It is our trade." Of middle height, slight, and with a foreign accent that leaned a trifle to the German. Mr. Crome's brows rose. "You know my lady, then?" "We are acquainted with her circumstances," Holmes returned. "She lost a bead last week." "She did so months ago," Crome corrected, "and broke her string again last Tuesday. She asked for a brass plate for the clasp. Her hands are thin, and she wished the hook to catch more surely. I am out of brass of the best sort and had to trim a plate to fit. She was particularly. His mouth tightened with a tradesman's offence. Particular to rudeness. Holmes inclined his head. We shall not trouble your brass further. One more question. Where do your customers who prefer German gloves purchase their kid? Crome's glance flicked to a little rack of handbills by the door. Scharf and Baumann of Clerkenwell. They have lately moved part of their stock to a warehouse by Great Portland Street to shorten their deliveries. Holmes's eyes glimmered. Convenient for a gentleman with a limp. When we had taken our leave and were once more in the street, fog creeping along the gutters like a cat, Holmes spoke in that soft inward voice I had come to dread, for it meant the case was tightening not only upon the quarry, but upon ourselves. See the skein, Watson. The Reverend's errand was innocent, neither more nor less than charity employed in good mourning. Yet charity carries news as silently as a nun, and our veiled lady listens at convent walls. She knows the measure of grief and the price of jet. She knows how a pin sits in satin. She knows where a pillar-box stands in a draught. Such knowledge speaks of a life too long on the edge of other people's houses. You imply a governess, or a companion, or a widow who has served as both. The letter signed with E. Elise, Emma, Eugenie. Take your pick of the European alphabet. But do not be bewitched by initials, my dear fellow. It may be anyone at all, or anything. His voice sharpened. It may even be the echo of a name we already know, stripped to a symbol to suit a theatre. We dined plainly in Baker Street, Holmes eating little, I confess, for appetite sits ill with a man who suspects the poor of London are being made the footmen of a melodrama. 9 had scarcely struck when there came a rush up our stairs. The door flew wide, and Inspector Bradstreet burst in like a cork from a shaken bottle. "Another note!" he cried, brandishing an envelope. "Left at the Harrington house by hand not 20 minutes since. And if I don't say it shows a woman's malice, then I'm no judge of writing." Holmes took the envelope, sniffed, smiled without mirth, and opened it with his forefinger under the flap, as delicate as a cat disjointing a songbird. The paper within bore 4 lines. When midnight tolls, the bride shall hear her vows once more. Where smoke goes up, no foot goes down. Knock twice, leave the door. The devil's own charade, Bradstreet growled. We'll post a man at every door in Kensington. You will post none at all, Holmes said quietly. Bradstreet's moustache bristled like a brush. I beg your pardon? You will take your men away and leave the Harrington house unwatched from 11 to 1. You will inform no soul of this but me. If you trust me, Inspector, you shall have your author. If you distrust me, you shall have headlines and nothing else. Upon my life, Holmes? Upon my life, Bradstreet, Holmes returned, with that sudden grey fire that could cow even a yard man. A drama cannot be caught by peering at its back clothes. It must be played on cue. We shall supply the cue. Watson, your revolver, my revolver. Holmes, surely. We shall not load it, he said, almost tenderly. It is a stage property like the rest, but the sight of it may suffice for the gallery. He turned away, went to his mantle, and with movements so swift I could scarcely follow, altered his appearance to that of a shabby clerk. Cuffs frayed, collar wilted, a mournful moustache appearing under his nose, as if it had always been there. He drew from a drawer a pair of thin, fingerless gloves, which might once have been black, and were now a ghost of their old dye. He regarded himself in the glass and nodded. "Holmes," I cried, "you mean to go alone?" "For a little way," he said. "You will be where I tell you, and you will do what I do not explain. Forgive me, my dear fellow. The hand that writes our notes has learned our steps. I must for an hour forget that I have a friend. It cut me to the heart, yet seeing the iron purpose in his eye, I bowed. Where am I to be? At the garden, by the scullery wall, at 5 minutes past 12. If anyone knocks twice, you will not open. If anyone hangs a cord, cut it. If any woman weeps, do not console her. Your restraint may save a life. He turned to Bradstreet. Inspector, remove your men. Send one plain constable to loiter 3 doors down and look drunk. If he stirs before 1 o'clock, I shall never forgive you, and the newspapers will not forgive you either. Bradstreet blew out a breath between lips that stretched in a grimace halfway to a grin. "You're the most infernal tyrant off the bench, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Very well, we'll do it your way. But if I find you in a ditch, you will not," Holmes returned, with that thin smile which in him was far from mirth. "You will find me with the truth by the elbow, which is not always the safest companion, but is always the right one." And so it was that, an hour before midnight, we parted company in the fog, Holmes melting eastward like a shadow in search of deeper shade, Bradstreet to disband his cordon with curses swallowed and orders bitten off, and I to Kensington, where the Harrington house loomed against the starlit haze like a ship becalmed upon a dark sea. The clocks chimed 11, then the half-hour, then the quarter. Each stroke seemed to fall upon my nerves as a hammer upon glass. The garden was very still. The kitchen flue gaped like a black mouth. Somewhere in the lane a cat yowled. Somewhere on the road a cab rattled by and was gone. At 5 minutes past 12 there came, from the far side of the house, the faintest of sounds, wood upon wood. Then, distinct and dreadful in that silence, 2 knocks upon the scullery door. I held my breath, held it until my chest burned, and did not move. A minute passed. Another. Then from the flue, a whisper of motion. A cord snaked down like a pale worm, loop seeking purchase. I had my knife ready, and with a single slice severed it. The free end leapt and wriggled and was still. A soft sound, almost a sob, came from above, and was gone. "Watson," whispered a voice in my ear so low I scarcely knew it. "Good." I started. Holmes crouched beside me, his shabby clerk's coat white with frost. His eyes shone like a cat's in the dark. He put a finger to his lips. From the lane there sounded the faintest tap of a ferrule upon stone. One, then another, then silence, as if whoever owned it had remembered to limp too late. Holmes's hand tightened upon my sleeve. "Patience," he breathed. "Our playwright has missed a cue. When he writes again, then we close the curtain." He drew me back into the deeper shadow of the shrubs, and there, as the stars wheeled and the city's breath smoked upon the air, we waited, Holmes as motionless as the carved angel upon some winter grave, I with every nerve at the screaming pitch only silence can produce, while the drama we did not yet comprehend prepared, somewhere out in the fog, the next scene of its merciless play. Chapter 8. The Trap is Set. There are nights in London that seem to hover upon the edge of unreality. Nights when the fog takes on a life of its own, when sound is distorted, when even the most rational man feels as though he has stepped unwittingly onto a stage. Such a night was the one upon which Holmes resolved to bring the hidden hand behind the Harrington affair into the light. For 2 days after the midnight knocking, the city lay under a mantle of bitter frost. The newspapers, ignorant of the deeper drama unfolding in Kensington, concerned themselves with trivial matters. A speech in Parliament, the theft of a jewelled snuff-box from a baronet's house, the collapse of a warehouse in Limehouse, Holmes scarcely glanced at the columns. He spent those days in a state of quiet and meticulous preparation, moving between Baker Street, Clerkenwell, and Kensington with that unerring precision that always struck me as part hunter, part mathematician. On the morning of the second day, he placed before me on the breakfast table a small, flat box of polished wood. "Watson," he said, "behold the difference between a trap laid by a poacher and one laid by a naturalist." Inside lay a contrivance of the simplest kind, a length of fine silk cord, a strip of black cloth, and a brass whistle no larger than my thumb. "This," he continued, "is our curtain cord, and this," he held up the whistle, "is for you. If you see or hear anything untoward tonight, you will blow once. If I blow, you will come at once. If we both blow, Inspector Bradstreet will know that the time for subtlety is past." "You mean to set your snare tonight?" "Tonight," Holmes replied, his grey eyes glinting. "Our playwright believes the stage is his alone. We shall borrow his scenery and let him play his part to its conclusion." We arrived in Kensington shortly before 11. Bradstreet, grim and sceptical, had agreed, though not without grumbling, to withdraw his visible men, leaving only one constable in plain clothes to loiter nearby. The house stood silent, its windows dark. Mrs. Harrington had been persuaded to spend the night with her aunt in Bayswater. Only the housekeeper and footman remained within, under instructions to retire early and respond to nothing. Holmes had brought with him a curious bundle, which he unwrapped in the dressing-room. From it emerged a black cloak, a thin veil, and a pair of well-worn women's shoes. Stage properties borrowed, I learned later, from a customer in Drury Lane. "Holmes," I exclaimed. "You are not, on the contrary," he said mildly, donning the cloak and veil. "I intend to be precisely what our friend expects. A veiled lady at midnight. He will not come for Watson the doctor, nor Holmes the detective, but for a figure who answers his cue." I watched, half amused, half anxious, as he transformed himself. Beneath the veil, his aquiline features disappeared entirely. His slight build and careful arrangement of the cloak rendered him, in the half-light, almost convincing, as a woman of middling height and uncertain respectability. "You will be in the garden," he said to me. "Your post is beneath the scullery window. When the clock strikes 12, you will see me descend by the same means our midnight visitor employed. If anyone else attempts to do so, cut their line. We have rehearsed this. And you? I shall be within in the dressing-room. If our friend attempts to ingress through the flue again, he shall find the bride awaiting him." The house settled into its eerie quiet. I took up my position in the garden, concealed in the shadow of the shrubs. The frost had hardened the gravel, and the breath hung before my face in ghostly clouds. Overhead, the stars shone faintly through a thin haze. In the distance, a church bell chimed the quarter hours, each one a sharp reminder of the approaching moment. At 5 minutes to midnight, I heard it, a soft scuffle upon the kitchen roof, followed by the creak of ivy. Then, exactly as before, a slender cord slid down from the scullery flue. This time, however, Holmes had looped his silk cord beside it, so that to any watcher above, the two would seem one. I held my breath. Moments later, a figure descended the cord, silent, deliberate, until it alighted upon the frosted gravel. Even through the darkness I could discern the outline, slight, cloaked and wearing a heavy veil. But this figure did not pause. It turned toward the scullery door and raised a hand to knock, twice, precisely as the letter had instructed. Before it could, the door swung inward. Holmes, veiled and cloaked like its mirror, stood upon the threshold. For the briefest instant, both figures froze, two silhouettes facing one another like reflections in a black mirror. Then the intruder stepped forward with a quick, almost desperate motion, as if to whisper. Holmes extended his arm and, with astonishing speed, caught the figure by the wrist. There was a brief struggle, no more than a few seconds. But in that moment I saw the intruder's veil slip, revealing a pale, angular face, framed by dark hair, streaked with grey. A woman's face, sharp, intelligent, and set in lines of bitter resolve. Holmes's whistle cut the night air. I surged forward, revolver in hand, just as the figure wrenched free and bolted towards the garden gate. But Bradstreet's plainclothes man, alerted by the whistle, was waiting there. The woman struck at him with a small, gleaming knife, but he was too quick. He caught her by the arm and twisted the weapon from her grasp. By the time I reached them, Holmes had lowered his veil, his face alight with that peculiar, cold satisfaction that comes only when his deductions meet their quarry. "Inspector Bradstreet will be delighted," he said, breathing hard but uninjured. "The playwright has made her entrance." The woman stood between us, silent and still, her eyes flicking from one to the other with the calmness of someone who has long since rehearsed this moment. She was perhaps 40, but her figure was slight, and her bearing unmistakably that of one accustomed to employment in genteel households. Her clothing was plain but neat. Her gloves were fine black kid of German make. "Name!" Bradstreet barked as he arrived, breath steaming. The woman did not speak. "Very well," Holmes said softly. "Then allow me. You are, or were, known as Fräulein Elise Baumgarten. You were once a governess in the household of a German merchant near Clerkenwell. Later, you entered service in a respectable English house where you became acquainted with Edward Harrington. When that acquaintance ended, abruptly upon his marriage, you followed him. Am I warm?" The woman's jaw tightened, but she did not answer. Holmes stepped closer, his voice low and measured. "You arranged Selby's presence as misdirection. You sent the letters. You crept into this house through the flue twice, and you persuaded the housemaid Ellen Clark to follow you, either by threat or by promise. Where is she?" At this, for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face, a brief shadow of something like regret, but she remained silent. Bradstreet clapped his hands. "Take her," he said to the constable. "We'll have her name and her story soon enough." As the woman was led away, Holmes stood very still, his eyes fixed upon the dark scullery door. "She is not the end," he said quietly. "She is the veil, the mask. But behind her stands the author." "You think there's someone else?" I asked. "I know it," Holmes replied. "A woman like Elise Baumgarten does not build illusions of this complexity for her own sake alone. There is a greater hand guiding her, a hand she fears." Later that night, as we sat by the fire in Baker Street, Holmes stretched out in his chair, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin. "She descended upon cue," he mused. "She knocked twice. She met the bride. But her eyes were not those of a woman confronting a rival. They were the eyes of a messenger expecting a signal." "A messenger?" "Yes, she did not look for Edward Harrington, Watson. She looked for someone else inside that house. The bride is merely the stage. The drama is elsewhere." He leaned forward, his voice low and taut. "And tomorrow we pull back the curtain." Chapter 9. The Web Tightens. Few scenes in my long acquaintance with Sherlock Holmes remain so vivid in my memory as the interrogation of Elise Baumgarten at Scotland Yard, though the public has come to imagine Holmes's triumphs as swift flashes of brilliance. Villains confounded, mysteries laid bare in an instant, The reality was often far more intricate. Holmes's victories were web spun over hours or days, invisible until the final thread was drawn tight. Elise Baumgarten's silence, as it turned out, only strengthened the strands he had already set in place. Bradstreet received us the following morning in his small, paper-strewn office at the Yard. The room smelled of damp wool, tobacco, and the peculiar metallic tang of London's winter fog, which crept even into the precincts of justice. Elise sat opposite his desk, flanked by 2 constables. Her dark hair had been pulled back severely. Her plain dress, though modest, was impeccably neat. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, regarded us without fear, though I detected a faint tremor in the fingers clasped upon her lap. "She's as close-mouthed as a nun," Bradstreet muttered, pushing back from his desk. "Gave her name straight enough, but beyond that, not a word since last night. No address, no employer, no explanation. We've turned out her lodgings in Clerkenwell. Nothing but sewing things, a rosary, and some foreign letters, all in German. We'll have them translated by noon." Holmes regarded her in silence for some moments, his keen eyes taking in every detail. The faint soot on her cuffs, the glove button straining ever so slightly on her left hand, the composed but inwardly taut posture. At length he spoke, not to Bradstreet, but to her. "Fräulein Baumgarten," he said in perfect, unhurried German, "you have played your part well, but you have mistaken the play." She started almost imperceptibly. The language had reached her where English had failed. Her reply, when it came, was cold and measured. "I do not know you." "But I know you," Holmes said softly. "Governess in Bremen until 1883. Companion to the daughters of Herr Schreiber, merchant of Clerkenwell, 1884-1889. Dismissed after a matter involving a missing brooch and a gentleman visitor. Then a succession of posts in respectable London houses, none held long. You are intelligent, observant, and accustomed to the backstage of other people's lives. But this time you were not merely an observer." A faint line appeared between her brows. "You know much, Herr Holmes." "I know enough to see that you are not the author of this affair," he replied. "You are the veil, the mask through which another speaks. Tell us about Edward Harrington." At that name, something flickered in her face. Not love nor hatred, but something more complex. An emotion with roots too deep to name easily. "I knew him," she said at last, in English now. Her accent was precise, her voice low. "He was a man who did not belong to himself. Do you understand that?" Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Explain." "He often visited the house where I was a companion," she said. "Not for me, for his friend, a man named Pritchard, who was courting one of the daughters. Edward Harrington was charming, careless, full of promises. He spoke to everyone and meant nothing, or so I thought. But he was observed. There were people who knew more of him than he knew of himself." Holmes leaned forward. "People?" She hesitated, then, "A society. German mostly. Men who had dealings across the Channel. Political, sometimes financial. They met in private houses, never the same twice. Harrington fell in with them at Pritchard's invitation. At first it was dinners and talk, then letters, then errands. He thought it was all a game, a little intrigue to amuse himself. But it was not a game to them," Bradstreet snorted. "Foreign societies. There is always some conspiracy in these tales." Holmes silenced him with a glance. "Go on, Fräulein." "One night," she continued, "there was a quarrel. Harrington had carried a packet, letters they said, across the Channel to Bremen. But something went wrong. A man was arrested. They blamed Harrington. He denied everything. They told him he had broken a vow. He laughed. I remember it, how he laughed. And these men, do they still watch him?" "They do not forgive," she said simply. Bradstreet leaned forward. "So you crept into his house to punish him, eh? You and your friends?" She met his gaze coldly. "No, I crept into that house because I was told to. Weeks ago, I was approached by a man I once knew. A figure from those days. He gave me money. He told me that when the bride was alone, I was to deliver a message. I was not to harm anyone, only to bring the letter, make sure it was received, and to await instructions. When the time came, I obeyed." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And the maid, Ellen Clark." Elise's composure faltered for the first time. She lowered her eyes. "She followed me. She thought she could find him. Edward. She trusted easily. I told her not to, but she insisted. He told me to bring her. So I did, Holmes repeated softly. "This man, who is he?" She lifted her chin with sudden defiance. "You will not find him." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, I have already found him." Both Bradstreet and I started. Elise's eyes widened just slightly. Holmes rose and paced to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "You see, Fräulein, you have made several small errors. First, you chose a courier whose limp was too theatrical. Second, you employed your old tradesman, Mr. Crome, to restring your rosary, thereby leaving us a brass plate with a freshly trimmed edge, one which matched the shaving beneath the dressing-table. Third, and most telling, you corresponded through St. Pancras, which places your confederate here, in London, not abroad." He turned, his eyes alight. "The Reverend Armitage." There was a gasp, from Elise and from me. Holmes continued inexorably. "You thought yourself invisible, Fräulein, but you are not the only one who watches. The Reverend has been the one fixed point in this affair. Always present, always observant, always near. He saw Selby in the lane because he was there himself. He visited Crome's shop. He carried jet and news in his satchel under the guise of charity. A clergyman's visits open doors that would otherwise remain shut." Bradstreet slapped his desk. "By heaven, Holmes, are you serious?" "Entirely. Reverend Samuel Armitage, a man of sober habits, but with two lives, the parish and the society. Harrington, careless as ever, laughed at their vows. Armitage, devout to his cause, could not forgive. He used Elise as a messenger, Selby as a distraction, and the flue as a stage entrance. Ellen Clark followed Elise and fell into his hands. Edward Harrington disappeared not because of magic, but because the Reverend had the key trick, the knowledge of the house, and the trust of its occupants." Elise rose suddenly, her voice sharp. "You do not know what you speak of." Holmes's tone hardened. "On the contrary, I know that the Reverend was seen near the house on the night in question. I know that he purchased a jet from Crome on the same day you did. I know that he has a small outbuilding on the Mission property, a disused coal store large enough to conceal 2 people. And I know that this morning a telegram was sent from St. Pancras Station to Bremen under the name E. Armitage." The silence in the room was like the drawing of breath before a storm. Bradstreet sprang to his feet. "We'll have him in the irons before nightfall." Holmes raised a hand. "Gently, Inspector. A trap is most effective when the animal still believes itself unseen. Let him move. Let him come tonight as he will, for the final act. He will not resist the temptation to witness the bride's unravelling with his own eyes." He turned to Elise, whose proud mask had slipped to reveal something almost like fear. "And you, Fräulein, have a choice. Continue to shield him and be hanged as his accomplice, or speak and perhaps save yourself." Her lips parted. For a moment I thought she would answer. Then she shut them firmly, and the light in her eyes dimmed to resignation. Holmes studied her for a moment longer, then turned to Bradstreet. Hold her, quietly, no announcements. If the Reverend suspects we know, he will vanish." Bradstreet nodded grimly. "I'll have men on him day and night." "No," Holmes said sharply. "Men will spook him. Watson and I will watch. He trusts me least. That is my advantage." That night, as we returned to Baker Street, Holmes walked in silence. When at last he spoke, it was in that low, fierce tone that signalled the net closing. "The Reverend," he said, "a man who preaches vows by day and breaks them by night. He has built his theatre with precision. But tomorrow night, Watson, the final scene is his undoing." I said nothing. I merely matched his stride through the frozen London streets. The image of the Reverend's calm face rising before me like a spectre. The web had been spun, and Holmes, with the patience of the spider, was waiting for the tremor. Chapter 10. The Midnight Confrontation. The following day passed in a state of tense, almost theatrical stillness, as if London itself were holding its breath. Holmes rose early and spent the morning in quiet but deliberate activity. He wrote 3 short notes, dispatched 2 messengers, and disappeared for nearly 2 hours without explanation. When he returned shortly after noon, there was an unmistakable light in his eyes, cold, focused, anticipatory. The hunter had taken his place on the edge of the clearing, and the quarry had yet to suspect. "Tonight," he said simply, hanging up his overcoat, "we drew the curtain on the Reverend. Bradstreet is prepared?" I asked. "He has agreed to my plan with the reluctance of a man accepting bitter medicine," Holmes replied with the faintest smile. "His men will surround the property in silence from 11 onwards. No arrests are to be made until my signal. The good Reverend must not suspect a single thread has been moved. Only then will he step into the web." We arrived in Kensington as the lamps were being lit. A pale, clean moon hung above the rooftops. The fog of the previous nights replaced by a bitter, crystalline cold that set the pavements ringing under horses' hooves. The Harrington house loomed solemn and dark, the shutters drawn. Mrs. Harrington was absent, still staying with her aunt in Bayswater. Only Mrs. Barlow and the footman were within, both instructed to retire early and keep to their rooms. Holmes inspected the house carefully before the operation began. The scullery flue, the garden gate, the corridor leading from the dressing-room, all were examined with the methodical eye of a chess player setting his final pieces. He stationed me in the garden once more, concealed behind the shrubs near the scullery wall, revolver in my pocket and whistle ready at hand. Shortly before midnight, Holmes positioned himself inside the house. He had chosen Edward Harrington's dressing-room as the stage for the confrontation, not because of sentiment, but because it was the place where the Reverend's illusion had been born. If the locked room trick was to be answered, it would be answered where it began. The house lay silent. The frost made the gravel sharp underfoot, and the ivy glistened in the moonlight like black lace. I crouched low, the cold seeping through my boots, and fixed my gaze on the scullery flue. Midnight approached. Then I heard it, the faintest scrape, stone against metal, followed by the soft rhythmic sound of a ferule tapping once, twice, then silence. I held my breath. A dark figure emerged from the lane, moving with the certainty of someone long familiar with the path. He was cloaked against the cold, his hat pulled low, but I knew that angular silhouette, that measured stride, Reverend Samuel Armitage. He paused beneath the flue, glanced once toward the street, then produced a coiled length of silk cord from within his cloak. With practised movements he tossed the cord upward. It caught on an iron brace with the ease of long rehearsal. He ascended quickly, No limp now, his cloak billowing behind him like the wing of some nocturnal bird. In seconds, he had vanished through the scullery flue. I waited until the faint scrape of his boots disappeared within, then moved silently to my second position. Beneath the garden window that looked into the corridor by the dressing room, Holmes had insisted that my role was to be patient, unseen, and ready. When the signal comes, he had said, do not hesitate. Inside the house, the Reverend moved like a man retracing well-worn steps. Holmes, concealed behind the half-open door of the adjoining bedroom, watched through the narrow crack as Armitage emerged into the darkened corridor. The moonlight through the landing window revealed his face for the first time without the mask of piety. It was hard, determined, and utterly without hesitation. He carried a small lantern, shaded, and a bundle beneath his arm. He reached the dressing-room door, pushed it open, and entered. I was not present to see what happened next, but Holmes described it to me afterward with his usual clarity. Armitage set his lantern upon the writing table, placed the bundle beside it, and drew from his pocket a key. It was Edward Harrington's key, the same that had been plucked from the lock with Elise Baumgarten's cunning card trick. With a soft click, he turned it in the lock, securing the door from the inside. The dressing-room was once again sealed. Then, with quiet reverence, he opened the bundle. Inside lay a black stole, a small book bound in worn leather, and a silver cross. He draped the stole over his shoulders and opened the book, muttering in low, rhythmic German. A liturgy of some kind, though not a Christian one. It was a ceremony, a ritual. At that moment Holmes stepped from the shadows. "Good evening, Reverend," he said. Armitage spun round, eyes blazing. For the briefest instant his composure cracked, but he recovered quickly. "Mr. Holmes, you intrude upon holy work." "Holy!" Holmes's voice was cool and edgy. "You have broken into this house by a flue, Reverend. I doubt your bishop would consider that holy ground." The Reverend's mouth twisted into something like a smile. This house was consecrated the moment he broke his vow. Holmes took a step closer. "Edward Harrington." "Yes," Armitage said, almost triumphantly. "The bridegroom who thought he could mock God and man alike. He joined us, Holmes. He swore before witnesses to carry out a trust. And then, on the eve of his marriage, he betrayed it." "He betrayed us." Holmes's voice was steady. "And so you lured him here. You set the stage. Selby as misdirection, Elise as messenger, Ellen Clark as leverage. You wanted the world to believe he vanished into thin air." The Reverend's eyes burned. "He did vanish, of his own will. He came to me that night. I offered him a chance to atone. He took it. Where is he now?" Holmes demanded. Armitage's voice dropped to a whisper. "Beyond your reach." Holmes's hand flicked. The whistle at his lips gave a single piercing note that echoed through the silent house. I heard the whistle and moved. Leaping from my hiding place, I ran to the scullery door, revolver in hand. Bradstreet's men, stationed in silence nearby, rushed forward. Within moments the house was surrounded. Inside, Armitage made a desperate movement toward the window. Holmes was faster. With the precision of a fencer, he intercepted him, locking the Reverend's arm in a grip that was both firm and almost surgical in its accuracy. "You have played your last scene, Reverend," Holmes said coldly. Armitage struggled, but it was useless. When Bradstreet and I burst into the dressing-room seconds later, we found Holmes standing over him, lantern light catching the hard planes of both their faces, the brilliant hunter and the trapped fanatic. The search that followed was swift and thorough. Guided by information Elise Baumgarten reluctantly confirmed under questioning, Bradstreet's men raided the mission outbuilding near St. Matthew's. There, In a concealed chamber beneath the floorboards, they found Edward Harrington, alive, dishevelled but unharmed, though under the Reverend's strict control for several days. Ellen Clark was there too, frightened but uninjured. The Reverend had convinced Harrington that surrendering himself to the society was the only way to save his new wife from disgrace. Ellen had been lured with promises of helping him escape. It was a theatre of guilt, manipulation, and fear, staged by a clergyman who saw himself as judge, jury, and confessor. That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat before the fire, his violin untouched on the table. I had never seen him look more thoughtful or more weary. "Armitage is not mad," he said quietly. "He is something far more dangerous. A rational man convinced that his cause is divine. He built a perfect illusion, Watson. A locked room, a vanished bridegroom, a limping man, a veiled lady, a midnight ritual. And he did it all under the cloak of respectability." "And you unmasked him," I said. He shook his head slightly. "I observed him. The unmasking was his own doing. Fanaticism always performs its own finale." I looked at him then, not merely as my friend, but as the relentless mind that had once more pierced the veil between appearance and reality. The frost outside thickened upon the panes. London slept, and in the flickering firelight, Holmes seemed for a moment less like a man, and more like some austere sentinel, watching, waiting, ever 3 steps ahead. Chapter 11. The Confession of Edward Harrington. It was 3 days after the Reverend's arrest when Edward Harrington was finally brought to Baker Street. Bradstreet, practical as ever, had insisted the formal statement be taken at the yard, but Holmes, with that curious blend of arrogance and insight which so often guided his decisions, arranged instead for the interview to take place in our sitting-room. "A man will lie to the law out of fear," he said. "He will lie to his friends out of shame, but he will speak the truth to silence, if it is intelligent silence." The day was grey, the frost lingering in dull patches on the pavements. Harrington arrived shortly before noon, escorted by a single constable, and entered the room with the hesitant gait of a man who has walked too long in darkness and is uncertain of the light. He was pale, unshaven, his once fashionable coat hanging loosely from his shoulders. Yet there was still something of the gentleman about him. The set of the jaw, the fine bones of the face, the careful courtesy with which he bowed to me and to Holmes. "My dear Watson," he said hoarsely, gripping my hand, "I have you to thank, I am told, for Ellen's safety. I shall never forget it. She was brave," I replied, "but she trusted unwisely." His eyes clouded, as did I. Holmes gestured to the chair by the fire, regarding him with that cool, searching gaze which few men could endure for long. Harrington, however, seemed too weary to resist. "You understand, Mr. Harrington," Holmes began, "that this conversation is not an interrogation. The Reverend Armitage will face trial for his crimes. Elise Baumgarten, too, has chosen to give testimony in exchange for leniency. But there remains a part of this matter which only you can illuminate." Harrington stared into the fire. For a moment he said nothing. Then he sighed, a long, heavy breath that seemed to draw years with it. "Yes," he said slowly, "it is time I spoke." He told his story without flourish, in the quiet, unhurried tones of a man laying bare the structure of his own downfall. "I was never a model of constancy," he began. "You must understand that, Watson. Before my marriage, I lived rather untethered life. I had friends across Europe, particularly among the German expatriate community in London. Through one of them, Pritchard, I was introduced to a circle of men who met to discuss matters of trade, politics, and what they liked to call the destiny of nations. At first I attended out of curiosity. Later, I confess, out of vanity. They were clever men, and they flattered me. They spoke of England's role, of alliances, of secret pacts. It was like stepping behind the curtain of a theatre. He rubbed his hands together as if cold. In time, they trusted me with small errands, letters, messages, introductions. Nothing treasonous, or so I believed. I told myself it was merely social intrigue. And then, about a year ago, they asked me to carry a packet to Bremen. It contained, they said, financial documents. I was crossing the Channel anyway. It seemed harmless. Holmes's eyes never left him. And what did it truly contain? I learned later, Harrington said grimly, that it was a list of names, sympathizers, informants, agents, intended for their associates abroad. A man was arrested because of it. They claimed I had been followed, that I was careless. Perhaps I was. Perhaps I was drunk. I do not remember. But they held me responsible, and they made you swear a vow, Holmes said quietly. Yes, a vow of silence, a vow to serve their cause if called upon. I gave it because I was terrified, and then, like a fool, I convinced myself it was all behind me. I fell in love with Clara. I am married. I thought I had stepped out of the shadows. His voice faltered. I saw then not the careless bridegroom of Mrs. Harrington's memories, but a man hollowed out by his own cowardice. 2 weeks after the wedding, he continued, a letter came. It was unsigned, but I knew the hand. The bride has not yet mourned enough, it said. When the hour strikes, you will atone. I burned it. Then Armitage came to me in person. Holmes leaned forward. Describe that meeting. It was late. He came to the house unannounced, dressed not as a clergyman, but in plain clothes. He asked to speak privately. I was surprised, but I knew him from the gatherings years ago. He had always been a strange man. Pious, intense, convinced that their little circle was some holy order. He told me the society had not forgotten. He said they had chosen me for a task, a last act of atonement. I refused. He smiled and said that vows made in the name of God cannot be broken by marriage. Harrington shuddered. He told me that if I did not come to him on the appointed night, they would bring disgrace upon Clara. Those secrets would be revealed, that she would know what sort of man she had married. He spoke of vows, betrayal, and punishment. He terrified me. So you went, Holmes said. Yes, Harrington whispered. I went. After Clara retired that night, I dressed quietly and went to the dressing room. I locked the door, not to keep others out, but to keep myself in. I knew I might falter. He was waiting in the garden. Elise had already entered by the flue. She handed me a second letter, instructing me to follow her. I obeyed like a coward. And the key? Holmes asked. He used a trick, Harrington said. He told me to drop the key on the table, leave the light burning, and then climb down the rope. He removed the key using that card contrivance you found. When the servants broke in, it would appear as though I had vanished. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And Ellen Clark? Harrington covered his face with his hands. She overheard me leaving. She followed Elise, thinking she might help me. Armitage saw her as a useful tool. He frightened her, told her she was part of a divine mission, and took her with us to the mission house. He looked up then, and the raw guilt in his face was almost painful to witness. I stayed hidden there for days. He came each night, reading from his books, speaking of penance. I was too weak to resist. It was only when you came for him that the spell broke. For some time, the only sound in the room was the soft crackle of the fire. Holmes rose and stood before the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Harrington," he said at last, "you understand the gravity of what you have confessed. Legally, You are guilty of little more than cowardice. Morally, perhaps much more. But I am not your judge. The Reverend Armitage will answer for his crimes, and the Society's London arm will find itself under closer scrutiny than it has ever known." Harrington bowed his head. "I deserve whatever comes." Holmes turned and his voice softened slightly. "Perhaps. But you also have a duty. You will tell the Yard everything you know. Every name, every letter, every meeting. Not to expiate your guilt, but to prevent others from weaving the same web around another fool." Harrington nodded slowly. "I will." After he left, Holmes stood for a long while in silence, staring into the fire. At last he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "Watson, do you see the pattern? A careless man gives a promise to those who understand how promises can bind. A zealot interprets that promise as divine. A woman, living in the shadows of others' lives, becomes the instrument. A servant girl becomes the pawn. And through it all runs a single thread, the illusion of inevitability." I said nothing. There was a gravity in his tone that did not invite interruption. "The locked room," Holmes continued, "was not a miracle. It was a trick. But the real lock was in Harrington's mind. Fear was the key, and Armitage turned it with precision. It is astonishing, Watson, how often the human mind will imprison itself when given a convincing set of bars." He turned then, and the light from the fire fell across his face, half in shadow, half illuminated. "There remains only one final scene. The trial will be formal, but the true ending is already written." As I looked at him in that moment, lean, ascetic, every nerve of his extraordinary mind still attuned to the case's after-echoes, I realized, not for the first time, that Holmes saw human folly with both surgeon's detachment and playwright's insight. The mystery had been solved, the villain unmasked, the victim saved, but beneath it all lay a quiet tragedy. A man undone not by enemies, but by his own weakness. The case of the mourning bride was drawing to its close. Only the final curtain remained.